This one time, you are mine. Those 3 words have haunted my every waking moment. It would be fair to say that I thought of nothing else for weeks. Whenever I asked my grandmother what it meant, she would only shake her head and say, "I don't like to think about it." After a while, I noticed that she was becoming visibly upset, so I stopped asking. Eventually, I came to think of it as just a story she had heard. A story that had somehow grown into reality and mixed itself into her memories. Years went by and I went off to college. My grandmother, now in her mid-90s, was still able to get around but had been diagnosed with dementia. There were good days and bad, but the days when her memory was vivid grew few and far between. Fortunately, my mom had retired, so she was able to be her full-time caregiver. Every once in a while, though, my grandma would wander away. My mother would often find her 6 houses down, contentedly talking to a neighbor. I came home to help whenever I could, and it was difficult but manageable. That is, until last week. My mom had settled my grandmother in the backyard glider and was in between doing the laundry and breakfast dishes. She had just come up from the basement. When glancing out the back window, she realized that my grandmother was gone. Quickly heading out to the back door, my mother checked the yard, the path around the garage, and the drive before heading to the front sidewalk. Looking up and down the streets, she saw nothing. Beginning to worry me now, she enlisted a few neighbors to help with the search. They knocked on every door and checked every single backyard. It was over an hour later when they found her 3 streets over in an old cemetery. But she wasn't looking at the graves. She was backed up against an old oak tree, staring terror-stricken at the cross over the entry of a church. My mother tried to calm her down, but my grandma didn't seem to hear or see anything else. She just kept staring at the church, holding the cross at her neck and chanting incomprehensible words over and over. My mother called an ambulance, then called me. It took me 3 hours to drive home, and I went straight to the hospital. I found my mom pacing back and forth at the window looking exhausted. She said that my grandma hadn't spoken or even opened her eyes since arriving at the hospital. Convincing my mom to go home and get some rest, I told her that I would stay here with grandma. I promised to call if anything changed. Sometime after midnight, I must have closed my eyes for a moment, because the next thing I remember was someone quietly calling my name. Chris. "Graham, are you alright?" "I'll get the doctor," I said. As I moved to get up from my chair, she put her hand softly on my arm. "No," she said quietly. "I'm alright. Just give me a moment." After pouring her a glass of water, I watched as she weakly took a drink. She glanced at me, then to the window and back. "Chris, I need to tell you something. It's about what happened at the Abbey," she said, almost in a whisper. "Graham, you should be resting," I said. "There will be plenty of time for resting soon enough," she replied. I started to object, but she shook her head defiantly. Looking her straight in the eyes, I could see that she was fully awake and aware, maybe for the first time in a long time. I nodded. She began right where she had left off, those many years ago. After I found the woman in the locked room, or the thing that had taken the form of a woman, I fainted. When I regained my senses, I was standing in a large chamber on the first floor of the Abbey. It was the room they used to care for the sick. Beds lined the walls all around me and were being occupied by the nuns that had fallen ill. At first, I thought they were sleeping, and then I noticed their eyes. None of the nuns could even blink, and they just stared blankly out into nothingness. Bordering on hysteria now, I ran from bed to bed, but was only met with the same glassy stare. Raising my hand to stifle a scream, I saw that both of my hands were covered in blood. All I could do was stand frozen, looking down in shock. I felt something forceful clamp down on my shoulder, and it spun me around strongly. I found myself face to face with the Mother Abbess, her face twisted in grief and fury. I screamed in surprise, and she held me tightly and she quickly led me down the hall to her quarters. Locking the door behind us, she slowly turned back towards me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. Her face softened and she spoke. "It's all right, dear. It's all right. Now you must gather your wits, for we don't have much time. Me walking over to a wash basin, she gently told me to clean away the blood on my face and my hands. Then she rummaged through the dresser and came back with a long, white nightdress. She spoke softly, but with urgency. "Put this on. You must leave here now, and never return. Go home to your family and see nothing of this. Tell them only that I sent you home and that there was an illness in the abbey," she said. Almost too afraid to ask, I stammered out, "Did I? No. You are innocent. It has the ability to enter a body at will and use the human form like an empty husk. You are powerless to stop it. Do not blame yourself. If anything, the fault is mine. It has been in my charge for more than 50 years. I was careless," the mother abbess said. "Is it still with me?" I whispered. "No, my dear. If that were the case, I would not still be among the living. But we cannot talk more now, for you must hurry. Before you go, though, you must promise me something." She gently removed a silver chain from around her neck, and I saw that it had a very old cross along with a golden medallion of Saint Benedict. She gently removed a silver chain from around her neck, and I saw that it held a very old cross along with a gold medallion of Saint Benedict. Placing it around my neck, she looked at me with the utmost seriousness. "You must promise to never take this off. It will keep you safe. It will keep her from finding you and your family," she said. Unlocking the door, she hurried me down the long hallway to the entrance of the abbey. She stood at the opening, and watching as I ran towards the road to the villages, she could no longer be seen. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of shouts and commotion. My mother told me there had been an accident and that the abbey was on fire. More thoughts than you could imagine raced through my mind, and I ran outside to see a smoke rising up far off in the distance. It took a few days, but when the embers finally cooled, the villagers found the oldest section of the abbey had burned and collapsed upon itself. They found some human remains in the ruins, even finding the bones of one body in the abbey chapel. The body they found was charred but intact, and I have no way of knowing, but I'm sure it was the mother abbess. She was released at last from her terrible charge, and I hope she finally found the peace in death that she could never find in life. As my grandmother finished her story, she reached under the neck of her hospital gown and brought out an old silver chain. She motioned for me to come closer, and then she placed it around my neck. "Here, child. I won't need this anymore. Promise me. Promise me like I promised her so long ago, never take this from your neck." I did what my grandmother asked. As I promised, I saw my grandmother suddenly relax, as if a weight had been lifted, or a promise kept. She closed her eyes to rest, and they never opened again. My grandmother passed away quietly and peacefully in her sleep the next day. My mom and I right by her side. I never told my mother the story. I never told anyone until now. I always wear the silver chain. I never take it off. My grandmother kept her promise, and I will keep mine.